The trailhead was shrouded in mist when Claire arrived, the sun barely a suggestion behind layers of grey clouds. She had always loved the solitude of hiking at dawn, when the world felt suspended in a quiet, fragile balance. The parking lot was empty, save for her car, and the forest stretched ahead like a secret waiting to be uncovered. Her pack felt snug against her shoulders, and her boots crunched on the gravel as she took her first steps into the woods. The air was crisp, damp with the promise of rain. Her watch read 6:10 a.m. when she glanced down at it, checking to make sure she was on schedule. The plan was simple: a loop trail that would take about 2 hours. She had hiked it before and knew the terrain well enough to feel confident. Claire liked order, routine, the comfort of predictable outcomes. The woods didn't scare her. If anything, they were a refuge from the clamor of her everyday life. The first hour passed uneventfully. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and the faint rustle of small animals darting through underbrush. She kept a steady pace, enjoying the rhythmic sound of her boots on the dirt path. The trail markers were familiar, and she noted them with satisfaction as she moved deeper into the woods. At one point, a squirrel darted across her path, startling her for a moment, but she laughed it off, adjusting her pack as she continued. She was nearing what she thought was the halfway point when the trail began to feel different. The birdsong had quieted, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed in around her. Claire slowed her pace, her boots now muffled by a thick carpet of moss that hadn't been there before. She frowned, glancing down. The trail was harder to discern, the edges blurring into the surrounding underbrush. Her watch read 7:15 a.m. She had been walking for over an hour, yet the scenery didn't match what she remembered from previous hikes. Claire told herself she must have missed a turn, though that seemed unlikely. She paused, scanning the trees for the familiar blue blaze that marked the trail. Nothing. Her stomach knotted, but she forced herself to remain calm. She could retrace her steps. That was the logical thing to do. Turning around, she walked back the way she had come, or thought she had. The trees seemed denser now, their trunks crowding together like silent sentinels. The air grew heavier, tinged with a metallic scent that made her throat tighten. She hadn't noticed it before. Her breathing quickened as she checked her watch again. 7:35 a.m. Only 20 minutes had passed since she turned around, but the forest felt darker, as though the day itself were retreating. She walked faster, her eyes darting from tree to tree, searching for any sign of the trail. The moss underfoot felt spongy, almost wet, and her boots sank slightly with each step. Panic crept in, but she shoved it down. Panic was useless. She needed to focus. She stopped again to catch her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. The silence was deafening now, the absence of sound unnerving in a way she couldn't articulate. Then she saw a figure in the distance, standing perfectly still among the trees. It was too far away to make out details, but it looked human. Relief flooded her. She raised her hand to wave, shouting, "Hey, can you help me? I think I'm lost." The figure didn't move. Claire's relief curdled into unease. She stepped closer, her boots squelching on the mossy ground. "Hello," she called again, her voice trembling slightly. The figure remained motionless. It was wearing something pale, almost blending into the mist that seemed to cling to the trees. She hesitated, a cold prickle running down her spine. Something about its stillness was wrong. No one stood that still, not naturally. Her legs felt leaden as she took another step forward. The figure turned abruptly, vanishing into the woods without a sound. Claire froze. The movement had been too sudden, too fluid, like the snap of a rubber band. Whoever or whatever it was, they had moved impossibly fast. Her mind scrambled for explanations, none of them comforting. A trick of the light? Someone playing a prank? She backed away, her instinct screaming at her to put distance between herself and that spot. Her watch read 8:15 a.m. when she glanced at it again. Though it felt like hours had passed, she swore under her breath, shaking her wrist as if the motion might jolt the hands into their proper place. The mist was thicker now, curling around her like grasping fingers. She couldn't shake the sensation that she was being watched. Determined to keep moving, she turned in what she hoped was the direction of the trailhead. The forest seemed to shift around her, the trees rearranging themselves in subtle, disorienting ways. No matter how far she walked, the landscape remained stubbornly unfamiliar. A cluster of boulders appeared on her left, slick with moss, She could have sworn she'd passed them already, though from the other direction. She stopped, her breath coming in short gasps. The knot of unease in her stomach had grown into full-blown dread. This wasn't normal. People didn't just wander in circles like this, unless something was wrong either with the forest or with themselves. Claire clenched her fists, trying to steady her thoughts. She had to keep going. She had to. A noise broke the silence. A low, guttural sound that seemed to vibrate in the air around her. It came from somewhere to her right, deep in the trees. Claire froze, every muscle in her body tensing. The sound came again, louder this time, a wet, choking noise that made her stomach turn. It didn't sound like any animal she'd ever heard. It sounded wrong, like the gurgle of something trying to breathe through water. She stumbled backward, her eyes darting through the trees. The mist was so thick now that she could barely see more than a few feet ahead. The noise grew fainter, receding into the distance, but she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had made it was still close. Too close. She turned and ran, her boots slipping on the mossy ground. Her foot caught on a root, and she went down hard, her hands scraping against the rough bark of a fallen log. Pain shot through her palms, but she pushed herself up, her breath ragged. When she glanced back, her stomach lurched. There, in the mist, were footprints, deep impressions in the moss, far too large to be hers. They trailed off into the woods, in the direction of the noise. Claire didn't wait to see if they were getting closer. She forced herself to her feet and kept moving, ignoring the ache in her hands and the burning in her lungs. The forest felt endless now, an unbroken expanse of shadow and mist. She was no longer sure which way was forward or back. Time seemed to stretch and warp, the minutes dragging out interminably. Her watch still read 8:15 a.m. When she finally stumbled into a clearing, she collapsed to her knees, gasping for air. The mist had thinned slightly here, allowing her a view of the open sky. But the relief was short-lived. In the center of the clearing stood something that made her blood run cold, a wooden structure, crude and haphazardly built, resembling a kind of altar. It was draped in strips of fabric, their colors faded and their edges frayed, and surrounded by strange symbols carved into the ground. She couldn't look away. The symbols seemed to pulse, their lines almost glowing in the dim light. Her gut told her to leave, to run, but her body refused to move. A faint hum filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. The hum grew louder, almost imperceptibly at first, then swelling until it felt like it was inside her skull. Claire clamped her hands over her ears, but it made no difference. It wasn't just a sound, it was a vibration, a force that seemed to penetrate her very bones. She staggered to her feet, her legs trembling as she backed away from the altar-like structure. The carvings in the ground seemed to shift, the symbols writhing like living things. Her breath hitched as she realized they weren't glowing from reflected light, they were emanating it, a faint, sickly green that pulsed in time with the hum. Her heart pounded against her ribs, and her vision blurred at the edges, the world tilting around her. Then the mist surged forward, rolling into the clearing as though alive. It twisted and spiraled, forming dense, unnatural shapes that hovered in the air. Claire stumbled back, tripping over her own feet and landing hard on the ground. The hum reached a crescendo, vibrating through her teeth and making her want to scream. Something moved within the mist. It wasn't the figure she had seen earlier, this was different. Larger. It loomed, its edges indistinct, a silhouette that seemed to ripple and stretch as it shifted. The mist swirled around it like it was being drawn into its body. Claire's hands scrambled for purchase on the mossy ground as she tried to crawl backward, her eyes locked on the thing that had taken shape before her. The humming stopped abruptly, plunging the clearing into an almost oppressive silence. The figure turned, or at least it seemed to. Its form was so formless, so alien, that she couldn't tell where it began or ended. But she felt its attention, a suffocating weight that pressed down on her chest, stealing the breath from her lungs. Her watch caught her eye, the tiny hand still frozen at 8:15 a.m. Somehow it seemed impossibly bright, the silver face glinting in the dim light. She clung to the sight of it, focusing on the familiar object as a tether to reality. Then the figure shifted again, a jerky, unnatural movement that sent a fresh wave of fear coursing through her. It began to approach. Claire scrambled to her feet, adrenaline surging through her as she turned and ran. The mist clung to her, curling around her legs like unseen hands trying to pull her back. She could hear something behind her, a low, wet noise that made her skin crawl. She didn't dare look back. The forest blurred around her as she ran, the trees seeming to close in, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms. Her lungs burned and her legs ached, but she pushed herself forward, driven by sheer terror. She stumbled again, catching herself against a tree, and risked a glance over her shoulder. The mist was following her, undulating like a living thing. She couldn't see the figure anymore, but she could feel it. Its presence was a cold, gnawing void at the edges of her awareness. She pressed on, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The trail had long since disappeared, the ground beneath her feet uneven and treacherous. When she finally burst through the tree line, she thought for a moment that she had escaped. She stood in another clearing, this one smaller, surrounded by towering pines. The air was still, the mist held at bay by some invisible barrier. She dropped to her knees, her entire body trembling with exhaustion. Her watch still read 8:15 a.m. "No," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "No, no, no," she shook her wrist again, as if that would somehow fix it, but the hands remained frozen, mocking her. She looked up at the sky, hoping to gauge the time by the position of the sun, but the clouds were thick and unbroken, a dull grey expanse that gave no clues. The quiet was wrong. It wasn't just an absence of sound, it was a vacuum, an emptiness that made her ears ring. She was about to stand when she noticed something in the center of the clearing. It was subtle at first, a slight distortion in the air, like heat waves rising off asphalt. As she stared, the distortion grew, solidifying into a shape. A door. It stood unsupported, its frame old and weathered, the wood cracked and splintered. It seemed to shimmer, as though it didn't quite belong in this world. The door had no knob, no handle, just a flat surface with faint carvings etched into the wood. Symbols. The same ones she had seen around the altar. Her stomach churned. The door shouldn't be there. It couldn't be there. And yet, it was. She felt drawn to it, an inexplicable pull that made her limbs feel heavy and sluggish. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but her body betrayed her, her feet carrying her forward, as though propelled by an unseen force. As she approached, she noticed that the symbols on the door were moving, their lines shifting and rearranging themselves into patterns that hurt to look at. Her vision blurred, and her head throbbed, but she couldn't stop. Her hand rose of its own accord, reaching for the surface of the door. The moment her fingers touched the wood, the world dissolved around her. Claire was falling or floating. She couldn't tell. The forest, the mist, the door, all of it was gone, replaced by a swirling void of light and shadow. She felt weightless, untethered, her body stretched and compressed in ways that defied logic. The air, if it was air, was thick and viscous, resisting her movements. She tried to scream, but no sound came. Time lost all meaning. Seconds, minutes, hours, she had no way of knowing how long she drifted in the void. Images flashed before her eyes, disjointed and nonsensical. A child crying in the dark. A vast, empty field beneath a blood-red sky. A shadowy figure standing at the edge of a cliff, staring into an abyss. She couldn't make sense of them, couldn't focus on any one thing before it was replaced by another. Then, with a jarring suddenness, she was back in the forest. The transition was so abrupt that she staggered, nearly falling to her knees. The trees were as she remembered them, the mist thinner now, almost gone. Her watch still read 8:15 a.m., but the light had changed. It was brighter, the muted grey of early morning replaced by the golden hues of late afternoon. Claire turned in a slow circle, disoriented. She recognized the area. It was close to the trailhead, near the parking lot. Relief flooded her, but it was quickly overshadowed by confusion. How had she gotten here? Had she imagined everything? Her pulse pounded in her ears as she stumbled toward where she thought the parking lot would be. When she emerged from the trees, she froze. Her car was still there, but it was covered in leaves and dirt, as though it had been sitting for days. She ran to it, her hands trembling as she fumbled for her keys. They were still in her pocket, but the metal felt cold, almost alien. She unlocked the door and climbed inside, slamming it shut behind her as if that could keep the forest out. Her phone was on the passenger seat, right where she'd left it. She grabbed it, her heart sinking as she saw the screen. Dozens of missed calls and messages. The battery was almost dead, but the date at the top of the screen was clear. 3 days had passed. Claire stared at the screen, her hands shaking so badly she almost dropped the phone. 3 days. It was impossible. She tried to steady her breathing, but the air in the car felt too thick, too hot. She unlocked the phone and scrolled through the missed calls. Her sister, Emily, had called the most, followed by a few friends and numbers she didn't recognize. Some of the messages were frantic, their timestamp spanning the entire 3 days she had been missing. "Where are you? Please call me. We've contacted the police. Claire, are you okay? Just let us know you're safe." She hit the call button for Emily, her fingers trembling against the glass screen. The phone rang once, twice, then connected. Claire, Emily's voice was sharp, high-pitched with panic. "It's me," Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm okay. I don't know what happened." "Oh my God," Emily's voice cracked. "Where are you? We've been looking for you for days. The police, everyone, they've been searching the woods." "Claire, what happened? Are you hurt?" Claire glanced out the window, her eyes darting to the tree line. The forest loomed dark and indifferent, its shadows swallowing the fading light of the day. "I'm near the trailhead," she said, "by my car. I think I'm fine, but Emily, I don't understand. It's still morning, my watch says." She stopped herself, realizing how absurd it sounded. "It's not morning," Emily said, her voice thick with disbelief. "It's Thursday afternoon." "Claire, you've been gone for 3 days. What are you talking about?" Claire's stomach churned. She didn't have the words to explain what had happened, or if she even believed it herself. The mist, the figure, the door, the void, it all felt too surreal, like fragments of a fever dream. But the dirt-covered car, the missed calls, the terrified tone in her sister's voice, they were real. They had to be. "I'll explain when I get home," she said, though she wasn't sure she could. "I just need to get out of here." "Stay on the phone with me," Emily pleaded. "Just until you're driving. Please." Claire nodded, even though Emily couldn't see her. "Okay," she said, gripping the steering wheel with one hand while balancing the phone in the other. She started the car, the engine sputtering to life after a few attempts. The sound felt jarring in the oppressive silence that seemed to linger around her. As she backed out of the lot, her headlights caught something on the edge of the woods. A figure stood just beyond the tree line, partially obscured by shadows. Claire's breath hitched. It was tall and pale, its face obscured by the same swirling mist that had plagued her in the forest. For a moment it didn't move, just stood there watching. Then it turned and melted into the darkness, disappearing as though it had never been there at all. "Claire? Are you okay?" Emily's voice jolted her back to the present. "I'm fine," Claire lied, her voice shaking. "I'm on my way now." She hung up without waiting for a response, her nerves too frayed to keep talking. The road ahead was empty, stretching out into the distance like a lifeline. She pressed her foot to the accelerator, desperate to put as much distance as possible between herself and the forest. The drive home felt interminable. The scenery blurred together, her focus split between the road and the gnawing sense of unease that refused to leave her. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed, though every time she glanced in the rearview mirror, the road was empty. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long, reaching toward her car as the sun dipped lower in the sky. When she finally pulled into her driveway, she felt a brief surge of relief. The familiar sight of her house, its warm porch light glowing in the fading daylight, grounded her. But as she stepped out of the car, a chill ran down her spine. Something felt off. She couldn't place it, but the air carried a tension, an invisible weight that pressed down on her. Her front door was locked, just as she had left it, and her key turned smoothly in the lock. She stepped inside, closing the door firmly behind her. The house was quiet, but not in the way she remembered. It was the same oppressive silence she had felt in the woods, heavy and unnatural. "Hello," she called out, her voice echoing faintly. Of course, no one answered. She set her pack down and made her way to the kitchen, her legs shaky beneath her. The familiar surroundings should have comforted her, but instead they felt alien, like a poorly constructed replica of her home. She checked her phone again. Emily had sent another message, "Call me when you're safe inside." Claire stared at the screen, her thumb hovering over the call button. Before she could press it, a faint noise made her freeze. It came from upstairs. A soft, rhythmic creak, like someone shifting their weight on loose floorboards. Her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't been upstairs in days. She had left the house empty. Slowly, she backed away from the kitchen, her eyes fixed on the staircase at the end of the hallway. The sound came again, louder this time. It wasn't just the floorboards, it was footsteps. Deliberate. Measured. "Is someone there?" she called, her voice breaking. The footsteps stopped. Claire's heart pounded so loudly she thought it might drown out everything else. She glanced toward the front door, calculating the distance, but her feet refused to move. Her body was frozen, caught between fight and flight. And flight. Then, slowly, something descended the stairs. At first she thought it was a shadow, a trick of the dim light. But as it moved closer, she realized it wasn't a shadow at all. It was a figure, its form indistinct, as though it were made of smoke. It moved with an unnatural fluidity, its head tilted at an impossible angle. Claire stumbled backward, her hands scrabbling for something, anything to defend herself. Her fingers closed around a heavy ceramic vase on the entryway table. She raised it, her arm trembling, as the figure reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped. It didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, its head tilted toward her as though studying her. "What do you want?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised one hand, or what passed for a hand, and pointed at her. Claire's watch began to vibrate violently against her wrist, the hand spinning wildly. The air around her grew thick and heavy, the same suffocating pressure she had felt in the clearing. And then, the figure spoke. Not with words, but with a sound, a deep, guttural noise that reverberated in her chest, carrying with it a single, chilling impression. He brought it back. The vase slipped from her fingers and shattered on the floor. Claire stumbled backward, her feet crunching over the broken shards of the vase. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the figure's words or whatever that sound had been. It hadn't spoken in a language she understood, but the meaning was clear, undeniable. She had brought something back. "What do you mean?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The figure tilted its head further, an unnatural movement that sent another wave of terror rolling through her. It didn't respond. Instead, it began to move closer, gliding more than walking, its form shifting and distorting like smoke caught in a breeze. Claire bolted for the door. Her fingers fumbled with the deadbolt, the metal slick with sweat. She could feel the air behind her growing colder, the presence of the figure bearing down on her. Finally, the lock clicked open, and she threw the door wide, sprinting out onto the porch. The street was empty, her neighborhood eerily quiet. She turned to look back at the house, half expecting to see the figure standing in the doorway. But it wasn't there. The house was dark and still, the way it should have been. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she backed away, her eyes fixed on the windows. A faint flicker of movement caught her attention, something shifting behind the curtains in the living room. She didn't wait to see what it was. She turned and ran, her feet pounding the pavement as she headed for Emily's house a few streets away. Emily had a spare key and, more importantly, a house that wasn't hers, a place that might feel safe, even if only for a little while. The thought of explaining what had happened felt impossible, but she couldn't be alone. Not after everything she'd seen. When she reached Emily's house, she banged on the door with both fists, her strength waning. Lights flicked on inside, and moments later, Emily opened the door, her face pale and lined with worry. Emily reached out, grabbing her shoulders and pulling her inside. "What's wrong? What happened?" Claire collapsed onto the couch, her chest heaving. She couldn't speak. The words wouldn't come. Emily knelt beside her, her hands gripping Claire's tightly. "You're scaring me. Talk to me. What's going on?" "There's something in my house," Claire managed, her voice hoarse. "Something I brought back. I don't know how." But she broke off, her throat tightening as fresh terror clawed its way up her spine. "It's not just the house. Emily, I don't think it's going to stay there." Emily's eyes widened. She looked toward the front door, as though expecting something or someone to appear at any moment. "We'll call the police," she said quickly. If someone's in your house. No, Claire shook her head violently. It's not. It's not a person. Emily, you wouldn't understand. Then make me understand, Emily insisted, her voice trembling. You've been missing for 3 days. You show up out of nowhere, and now you're talking about… what? A ghost? A monster? Claire didn't answer. She couldn't. The events of the past few hours, or had it been days, were a fractured mess in her mind, impossible to explain without sounding insane. Instead, she pulled up her sleeve and showed Emily the watch. Its hands were still spinning wildly, the motion unnatural, almost hypnotic. What the hell, Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. Is it broken? Claire shook her head. It started after I touched that door. The one in the woods. I don't know what it did, but she stopped as the air in the room seemed to shift. The temperature dropped, and the lights flickered once, twice before going out entirely. Emily's grip on her arm tightened. Claire? What's happening? I don't know, Claire whispered, her eyes darting around the room. The darkness was oppressive, heavier than it should have been. The faint hum she had heard in the clearing returned, vibrating through the walls and floor. It was here. Whatever she had brought back, it had followed her. The sound of glass shattering in the kitchen made both of them jump. Emily let out a strangled gasp, her eyes wide with fear. What was that? Claire stood, pulling Emily to her feet. We have to go, she said, her voice urgent. We can't stay here. Before Emily could respond, the humming grew louder, a low, resonant drone that made their teeth ache. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen, coalescing into shapes that writhed and twisted like living things. And then it appeared. The figure emerged from the darkness, its form indistinct but suffused with malice. Emily screamed, stumbling backward, but Claire grabbed her arm, yanking her toward the door. The figure didn't move, but its presence filled the room, suffocating and cold. The front door wouldn't open. No matter how hard Claire pulled, the lock refused to budge. Emily was sobbing now, her voice frantic. What is it? What does it want? Claire didn't answer. She didn't know. All she knew was the overwhelming sense of wrongness that radiated from the thing, a feeling that scraped against her mind like claws on stone. She turned toward the window, her only other option. Before she could move, the figure raised its hand, or whatever passed for a hand, and pointed at her. The humming stopped, replaced by a silence so absolute it seemed to swallow all sound. The shadows writhed faster, and Claire's vision began to blur, the edges of the room dissolving into the same swirling void she had seen in the forest. The last thing she heard before the darkness claimed her was Emily's voice, calling her name. And then, nothing. When Claire woke, she was lying on a cold, hard surface. The air was damp and thick, carrying an acrid, metallic scent that made her gag. She opened her eyes, but the darkness was absolute, pressing against her like a physical weight. For a moment, she wasn't sure if her eyes were even open. She reached out tentatively, her fingers brushing against something smooth and icy. The sensation sent a shiver up her spine. Emily, she called, her voice echoing faintly. It sounded small, swallowed by the vast emptiness around her. There was no answer. Only silence. She sat up, her movements stiff and sluggish, as though her body were weighed down by an invisible force. The ground beneath her felt slick, almost slimy, and the air was cold enough to bite at her skin. She fumbled for her watch, its familiar weight still on her wrist, and pressed the button to illuminate the face. The pale green light flickered, casting eerie shadows across her hands. The watch hands had stopped spinning, but they were no longer set to any recognizable time. Instead, they pointed to nonsensical positions, twitching faintly as if struggling to align themselves. She turned the watch light outward, hoping to illuminate her surroundings. The faint glow revealed smooth walls streaked with something dark and sticky. The material wasn't stone or wood, it was unlike anything she had ever seen, too polished and yet uneven, like the surface of a melted sculpture. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She wasn't in Emily's house. She wasn't even sure she was anywhere familiar anymore. The door in the woods, the void, the figure had taken her somewhere else. Somewhere she didn't belong. A noise broke the oppressive silence. a faint, wet slithering sound that made her skin crawl. It was distant, but it sent her heart racing. She scrambled to her feet, her legs trembling beneath her. The sound grew louder, coming from somewhere ahead, or maybe behind, she couldn't tell. It seemed to echo and warp, the direction impossible to pin down. "Hello," she called, hating how her voice quivered. "Is someone there?" The noise stopped. Claire held her breath, straining to hear any hint of movement. The silence was deafening, her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Then, a voice, a low, guttural whisper, spoke directly behind her. "You shouldn't have come." She spun around, the watchlight flickering wildly in her shaking hand. The beam illuminated nothing but the smooth, glistening walls. Her breath came in shallow gasps, the voice echoing in her mind long after it had stopped. She clutched her chest, trying to calm the frantic rhythm of her heart. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice cracking. "What do you want?" The only response was a deep, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through the very air around her. The walls pulsed faintly, the dark streaks glistening as though alive. She stumbled backward, nearly losing her footing on the slick surface. Her watchlight dimmed, then flickered out entirely, plunging her back into darkness. "No," she whispered, smacking the watch in desperation. "Not now, please." The darkness was alive. She could feel it pressing in on her, moving, shifting, as though it were a living entity. The wet slithering sound returned, closer now, accompanied by faint, almost imperceptible whispers. Words she couldn't understand, layered and overlapping, filled the air around her, clawing at the edges of her sanity. She ran. She didn't know where she was going, but she couldn't stay still. Her feet slipped and skidded on the treacherous ground, and her outstretched hands grazed the walls, which felt warm and sticky. The whispers grew louder, merging into a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Then she saw a faint light ahead, flickering like a dying candle. She stumbled toward it, her legs burning with every step. The whispers didn't follow her, but the slithering noise did, growing louder with each passing moment. She didn't dare look back. The light led her to an archway, a jagged opening carved into the wall. Beyond it was a massive chamber, illuminated by an eerie green glow that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The space was vast and possibly large, and filled with towering spires that jutted from the floor like jagged teeth. The air was thick and cold, the faint hum vibrating through her chest. At the center of the chamber stood the door. It was the same door she had touched in the forest, but it was larger now, towering over her like a monolith. The symbols on its surface writhed and pulsed with a malevolent energy, their faint glow casting long shadows across the chamber. Claire approached cautiously, her eyes darting around the room. The slithering noise had stopped, but she could still feel its presence, an oppressive weight that seemed to linger just beyond the edges of her vision. She reached out a trembling hand, her fingers hovering inches from the door's surface. "Claire?" She froze. The voice was unmistakable Emily's. It echoed through the chamber, soft and pleading. Claire spun around, her eyes searching for her sister. The shadows danced and twisted, but she saw no one. "Emily," she called, her voice cracking. "Where are you?" "Help me," the voice whispered, faint and desperate. It sounded close, as though Emily were just out of reach. Claire's chest tightened, a lump rising in her throat. She had to find her. She couldn't leave her sister here, wherever here was. But then, another voice spoke. Deeper. Harsher. The same guttural tone that had haunted her before. "It lies." Claire's stomach twisted. The air grew colder, the hum louder, as though the chamber itself were alive and angry. The symbols on the door pulsed faster, their glow intensifying. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to get as far away as possible. But she couldn't leave. Not without Emily. The voices clashed, overlapping in a chaotic storm of sound that filled her head, making her ears ring and her vision blur. She staggered back, clutching her head, her knees buckling beneath her. And then, everything went silent. The chamber was still, the oppressive energy gone. The door loomed before her, the symbols frozen mid-pulse. For a moment, Claire thought it was over, that she was safe. But as she stepped closer to the door, a shadow fell across her, impossibly large and unmistakably alive. It was behind her. The shadow swallowed the light around her, stretching impossibly tall and wide. Claire didn't want to turn around, didn't want to see what had cast it. The oppressive presence was unmistakable, its weight pressing against her like a physical force. Her hands trembled at her sides, and every instinct screamed at her to run, but her feet remained rooted to the slick, alien ground. She could hear it breathing, if breathing was even the right word for the deep, guttural rasp that filled the chamber. The sound was uneven, wet, and labored, like something forcing air through lungs that weren't meant to work. It sent chills racing down her spine. Slowly, unwillingly, she turned. The thing behind her defied understanding. It was massive, its form shifting and undulating like liquid caught in a windless storm. Its surface seemed to ripple with black ichor, shimmering faintly in the green glow of the chamber. It had no eyes, no face, no features she could recognize, but she felt its focus on her, an overwhelming, suffocating awareness that pinned her in place. And then it moved. The creature surged forward, its amorphous body stretching and coiling toward her like living shadows. Claire stumbled back, her breath hitching in her throat as she collided with the door. The symbols on its surface flared to life, their pulsing light burning brighter than ever before. The creature recoiled, its shape twisting and writhing, as though the light had seared it. For a moment Claire thought it might retreat, but then it let out a deafening roar, a sound so loud and primal that it shook the chamber, sending cracks spidering through the jagged spires around her. The door behind her pulsed again, and the hum returned, vibrating through her body. The symbols began to move, shifting and rearranging themselves into patterns she couldn't comprehend. Claire pressed her hands against the door, desperate for some kind of answer, some way out. A voice spoke not in her ears, but in her mind. It was cold, emotionless, and impossibly vast, each word echoing with the weight of countless lifetimes. You opened the way. Close it. The command sent a jolt through her, breaking through the fog of terror that had gripped her mind. Close it. The door. She didn't understand how, but she didn't need to. The symbols seemed to react to her thoughts, their glow intensifying as she focused on the idea of sealing the door. The creature let out another roar, its form lashing out like a storm. Tendrils of shadow reached for her, moving faster than she could react. One of them struck her shoulder, and she screamed as pain flared through her body, sharp and searing. She fell to her knees, her vision swimming, but she didn't let go of the door. The voice in her mind spoke again, louder this time, more urgent. Focus. Close it. Claire clenched her teeth, pushing past the pain. She poured every ounce of her will into the door, her hands trembling against its surface. The symbols burned brighter, their lines shifting into a new configuration. She didn't understand what she was doing, but the door seemed to. It responded, the hum growing louder and deeper, drowning out the creature's furious roars. The air around her grew colder, the chamber itself seeming to shrink as the light from the door enveloped her. The creature lashed out again, its tendrils whipping toward her, but they stopped just short of her body, as though repelled by the growing energy around her. And then, with a blinding flash, the door sealed. The light was so intense that it burned through her closed eyelids, and the hum reached a deafening crescendo before cutting out entirely. When Claire opened her eyes, the chamber was gone. The creature was gone. She was standing in the forest again, the soft light of dawn filtering through the trees. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed to the ground, her chest heaving. The forest was silent, but it was a natural silence this time, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of birds. It was over. Or so she thought. Her watch vibrated against her wrist. She glanced down, her heart sinking as she saw the hands spinning again, faster and faster. A faint whisper drifted through the air, so soft she could barely hear it. It isn't over. Claire looked around, the familiar forest suddenly feeling alien again. The sunlight seemed colder, the trees leaning in just a little too close. She staggered to her feet, clutching her wrist as the watch's vibrations grew more intense. Somewhere in the distance, the hum began to rise again,